Hello everybody and welcome to this theory video, which again is based on theme 4 and looking at international economics. Now I've put up on the screen here the full specification for 4.1. What this video is going to focus on is patterns of trade and terms of trade. So it's 4.1.3 and 4.1.4. Right, so what we're going to be thinking about then first of all is patterns of trade. So what we're looking at here then is we're trying to decide who trades with who and what do countries tend to trade with each other. Now I'm going to come back to this slide in a moment or two. So what I want to show you first of all is this, something we call geographical patterns of trade and something we call commodity patterns of trade. Right, now geographical patterns of trade is looking at which countries trade with who. Now, what we tend to find is a lot of trade takes place on geographical terms. So, for example, we have something we call intra-regional trade. And this is where continents genuinely trade with other countries within their same continent. And there are two different sort of main theories of this. One could be trade blocks. So, for example, the European Union allows for free trade between their members. Well, that therefore promotes trade between the countries that are members of that trading bloc. So this could promote trade between Germany and France, Italy and Spain, etc. You could also argue, though, that a lot of this geographical pattern of trade is based on historical ties. If countries have built up strong political allies and partnerships over years, it promotes trade between those different member nations. We also have something we call gravity theory, though, and that is where countries are more likely to trade with countries they're in close proximity to. And that is because of the cost of importing and exporting. The nearer a country is logistically, the easier, the quicker and the cheaper it is to bring goods and services in from that economy to yours. Okay, so you tend to find that a lot of trade is based on geography. So countries are more likely to trade with neighbours than they are with countries further afield. Doesn't mean that the countries nearer can produce it cheaper than countries further afield, but the logistics of getting it from that country and the cost of the shipping might outweigh the benefits of it being made cheaper in a different country across the world. We'd also got to think about that with trading blocks, we might have protectionist policies. So EU countries can trade freely with each other, but then there might be tariffs placed on goods brought in from Asia. So that makes it less likely that Europe will trade with Asia. Now, you've got some UK statistics here, which might sort of take a few people by surprise. So when you look at the UK statistics for geographical patterns of trade, 46% of our exports go to the EU. So nearly half of what we produce and export goes to European Union economies. 53% of what we import is from the EU. So over half of what we buy into our country from overseas will come in from the EU. So it just shows the importance of understanding geographical patterns of trade. Now, our trade with China is growing, but it's still fairly insignificant. Less than 4% of our exports go to China, and only 7% of our imports come from China. We tend to have this big assumption that most of the foreign goods that we buy are from China. Well, it's not true. We bring in far more from the EU than we do from China. It's also worth noting that our largest export market is America. Now that kind of goes a little bit against geographical patterns of trade. But what I would say, though, is for the UK, we're built up over the centuries, really, strong political friendship with America. And that stretches to economic as well. So it's kind of brought our two economies fairly close together. So either you've got the Atlantic Ocean, which separates us, that strong political relationship and economic one built up over centuries promotes trade between us and America. There is also a growth that what we call South-South trade, where developing economies are increasingly trading with other developing economies. Okay, so geographical patterns of trade is looking at which countries trade with who, and a lot of it tends to be based within regions. Right, now we've also got something we call commodity patterns of trade, and we're looking here at the types of products that are generally traded. Now, developing economies, so ones with low levels of economic development, tend to export mainly primary sector products. This could be commodities, it could be agriculture work, it could be mining things. So we could be looking here at, exporting oil or coal or other natural resources. It could be growing coffee or tea and exporting those things across the world. Developing economies can also be involved in light manufacturing. This could be linked to textiles industries. Now, what I would say is generally the portfolio of exports for developing economies is very, very limited. They tend to produce low value, low skilled products to the rest of the world. And look at these examples. Bangladesh, they've developed a light manufacturing industry linked to textiles. So when you look at their exports, it's dominated by the textiles industry. So it's an industry which allows for lots of low skilled people to access jobs within their economy. Kenya, look at this one. Kenya's main exports are tea, coffee, and flowers. So again, it's all things linked to farming, really, in general. So those are the things those countries tend to have comparative and absolute advantages in the production of. You then find that developed economies will generally have a much more diverse and complex portfolio of exports. And to illustrate the point, look at this. The UK, we export things which are far more higher skilled. So things like pharmaceutical products, business services, cultural, which could be music and film, financial products. So much more higher skilled productive things than what the likes of Bangladesh and Kenya export. It is worth noting the UK still exports primary sector produce like oil, but also we export some food. But we've got a much more diverse range of exports that we sell to the rest of the world. South Korea, very similar. So again, some very high skilled manufacturing goods they export to the rest of the world. So when you think about it, to produce the exports the UK and South Korea does, you've got to have good levels of human capital and infrastructure to support those industries. Vietnam's an interesting one, though, because we'd still class them as a developing economy, and they still have a large textile industry, but they are growing massively in computers. So you could argue that they're trying to make their exports more diverse and complex as a way of developing their economy further. Now, just to go back to this then, what we know then is that a lot of trade is based on geography, but also we focused on what we call commodity patterns of trade. Now, to a certain extent, this will give you an idea of what will affect who we trade with based on comparative advantage. If one economy can produce something at a lower opportunity cost than we can, then the argument would be that we should buy that good from their economy and therefore move our resources to more efficient, low opportunity cost industries. And then we trade with each other based on the theory of comparative advantage. It could be based on wages and costs. So if an economy can produce something using workers at lower wage rates, then we're going to trade with that country if they can make it cheaper than we can. You've also got the growth of global supply chains. So this could be based on where the natural resources are or where the cheap, efficient factories are producing certain goods and services. Now, we cover trading blocks in geographical patterns of trade, but we can also have something we call a bilateral trading agreement. And this is where two economies might agree to come together to lower trade restrictions of each other. So this could be the UK and Australia, for example. And if both countries agree to reduce their trade restrictions, it would lead to more trade taking place between their economies. Exchange rate changes will have a big impact on things as well. So if our currency was to gain value against another economy, it's likely that we'll buy more of that country's exports because they now become cheaper to buy from that country. If our economy's exchange rate was to fall in value, other countries might buy more of our goods and services. And then the last one, geography. We mentioned this one before under geographical patterns of trade. You got the ease of trading with your nearby neighbours. Those countries you built up political relationships with, economic relationships. Your history is quite shared and entwined. Logistically, it's easier to trade with these countries, cheaper to move things from their country to your country, etc. So, guys, patterns of trade is about looking at who countries trade with and what those countries trade with each other. Right, what I'd now like to do is to hit pause and think about these 5 different questions. Please write down your answers, and then when you're ready, please hit play again, please. Right, welcome back. Now, what we're going to be looking at now is something a little bit different, and it's called terms of trade. Now, look at that definition of what this is, terms of trade. It measures the price of a country's exports relative to the price of its imports. So what it's therefore measuring is that when we export a certain basket of goods and services, how many imports can we buy with it? So it's many ways, it's a measure of international competitiveness. You've got a formula, the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices multiplied by 100. So the logic would be that if we were to increase our import prices, then it would mean that for the same volume of exports, you can now buy fewer imports. If export prices were to grow, then it would mean for the same basket of exports, you can buy more imports. Now, what will influence your terms of trade is anything that will affect export and import prices. So if anything leads to export prices growing, that would lead to your terms of trade improving. If anything led to your import prices increasing, that would lead to your terms of trade worsening. Right. Let's now work through a numerical example of this. Right, now what I've done, in this first table here, I've identified 4 different dates. We've got 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020. So what we do, we gather the prices of these exports and these imports over this time period. Now what you can see is that export prices have grown from 54.6 to 74.9 by 2020. Imports have grown from 52.5 up to 70.1. Now what we then do, we convert this data into index numbers. So we're going to use 1990 as the base. So we're going to set export prices equal to 100 and imports up to 100 as well. Now look at the year 2000, the index of export prices. To work out that new index number of 108.4, I've taken the new price, which was 59.2, divided it by the base price 54.6 and multiply it by 100. Let me show you one more. If you look at 2010, the price index of imports. To work out that 131.2, we would take the index of import prices, which was 68.9 in 2010. We divide it by the base price, which was 52.5. You multiply it by 100 and you get 131.2. Right, now look at the data that we've then got. The export prices across that time period there have grown from 100 to 137.2. So export prices have increased by 37.2%. Import prices have grown a little bit less by 33.5%. Right, now if we were to put this data into the formula, remember index of export price divided by index of import price, from 1990 to 2000 we get this. The new export price index was 108.4 divided by the import price 117.3 times 100 and we get 92.4. We've got a worsening terms of trade. Now what this would mean is for the same basket of exports we can now buy fewer imports. So our exports will buy fewer imports than what they would do before. From 2000 to 2010 we've got the same trend. So we've got worsening terms of trade, and then from 2010 to 2020 we can see the economy has benefited from improving terms of trade. For the same basket of exports we can now buy more imports. So when you look at the data from 1990 to 2000, due to worsening terms of trade, our basket of exports would only buy 92.4% as many imports as what it would do in the base year. From 2000 to 2010, it's even worse. The basket of exports would only buy 86.7% of the imports it would do before. From 2010 to 2020, the same basket of exports will buy an additional 2.8% imports on top than what it would do before. Right, what I'd now like to do is to pause and reflect on these 4 questions. So A, what is the formula to calculate terms of trade? B, what factors influence terms of trade? C, explain the causes and meaning of worsening, what we call declining terms of trade. And then D, what might cause improving terms of trade and what would this mean? So guys, once you've put down your answers and you're happy, please click play and move on with the video. Right, we're now going to be thinking about the impacts of changes in terms of trade. Now, when you've got improving terms of trade or TOT, we've got to remember what's happened is that export prices have increased relative to import prices. So the index of export prices has grown more than what the index of import prices has grown by. Now that will mean that your economy can buy more imports for your exports. Now what this will mean then is if your exports are now relatively more valuable than what they used to be compared to your imports, then importing now becomes cheaper. Okay, so when you export, you're sacrificing your goods and services. You can now buy more imports than what you could do before. So because importing is now cheaper, it means within your economy, you can buy essential products from across the world at lower prices than what you could do before. And this will ease cost-push inflation. And what it will hopefully do is to improve living standards of the people in your economy, because importing is now relatively cheaper than what it was before. What this will do, that it will lower your international competitiveness, because it means that your exports across the world are now relatively more expensive. Well, that could mean export demand starts to fall, and that could make it more difficult to generate export earnings, and it means that your trade performance will worsen. And that's the weird thing with this. Even though the terms of trade is improving, this would lead to your trade performance getting worse. So improving terms of trade will make trade performance worse because your export prices have grown relative to your import prices. Now, a worsening terms of trade then is where export prices fall relative to import prices. So it means that importing becomes relatively more expensive. So when you export your goods now, you're going to receive fewer imports in exchange for them what you would have done before. Right, now what this will do, it will potentially lower living standards, and that's because importing is now relatively more expensive. You've got to sell even more exports to buy the original amount of imports that you used to be able to get. And if importing becomes more expensive, it means that buying essentials into your economy will become more expensive, and that would push up cost-push inflation, which could lead to lower living standards. What this will do, though, it will improve your trade performance. Because if your export prices are now falling relative to your import prices, it means that your goods across the world will become more affordable and more competitive. So you will export more. So guys, we've got a weird, bizarre thing here. When we've got an improving terms of trade, trade performance will get worse. When you've got a worsening terms of trade performance will actually get better. Right. I just want to show you this, the significance of changes in terms of trade. Now, if we're thinking about standard living, if you've got an improving terms of trade, it means that importing becomes relatively cheaper. If we can now buy bigger supplies of imports into our economy for our exports, it means that people can access more goods and services, and that will improve people's living standards, cheaper imports in effect. If we were thinking about the price of imported technology, if our terms of trade was to worsen, maybe due to a weak exchange rate, it means the cost of buying those imports will become more expensive, and that will make it more difficult for us to access the best technology from across the world. Now, in terms of balance of payments performance or trade performance, I've put here a little note. It's important not to confuse the terms of trade with the balance of trade. If you've got an improving terms of trade, your trade performance will get worse due to higher relative export prices, sorry. So let me say that again. When you've got an improving terms of trade, it will worsen trade performance because your exports are now relatively more expensive than your imports. If you've got a worsening terms of trade, that will improve your trade performance because your exports are now more competitive across the world than what they were before. Right, just to wrap this up, everyone, you've now got this. What are the benefits and drawbacks of improving terms of trade, and what are the benefits and drawbacks of worsening terms of trade? Try and think about which one's better for living standards and which one is better for trade performance. Right, guys, once you've done that, that's the end of this video. Thank you very much.